April 18, 1943. 600 feet above the Solomon Sea, Major John Mitchell's eyes flicked between his compass and fuel gauges for the 100th time. The twin engines of his P-38 Lightning hummed in perfect synchronization, but the numbers didn't lie. They were already 200 miles from base, with another 235 to go. Radio silence was absolute. 16 Lightnings flew in tight formation behind him, skimming the wave tops to avoid Japanese radar, burning fuel at an alarming rate. Mitchell's gloved hand rested on the throttle quadrant, fingers unconsciously tracing the settings Charles Lindbergh had shown them just months before. Reduce RPM to 1600. Increase manifold pressure. Lean the mixture until the engines almost stumble. Then enrich slightly. It went against everything they'd been taught in flight school. Everything that screamed danger to a combat pilot's instincts. But without this one trick, they'd never make it to Bougainville. Never intercept Admiral Yamamoto's transport. Never make it home. The irony wasn't lost on him. The P-38 the plane pilots had once called a death trap. The fighter the British had rejected. The aircraft that seemed determined to kill its own pilots was about to attempt the impossible, all because a middle-aged civilian had taught them to fly it wrong. But just 18 months earlier, no one would have bet their life on a P-38 making it across the street, let alone across 870 miles of open ocean. The Lightning had arrived in 1942 as America's most advanced fighter, and its most dangerous. Lockheed had created a revolutionary design: twin engines, twin booms, tricycle landing gear, and a central nacelle for the pilot. It looked like something from a science fiction magazine. It flew like a nightmare. Test pilot Tony Levier nearly became its first victim. During a high-altitude dive test, his P-38 suddenly locked up at 500 miles per hour, controls frozen solid, the aircraft plummeting toward the California desert. He survived only by deploying flaps at the last second, pulling out so violently that rivets popped from the wings. "The thing tried to kill me," he told engineers afterward, hands still shaking. The British took one look at their initial shipments and sent them back. Too complex, too temperamental, too deadly to its own pilots. Training squadrons reported more casualties from accidents than the Japanese inflicted in combat. Engines failed without warning. The twin-boom design created violent yaw if one engine quit. Pilots who pushed into high-speed dives found themselves trapped in compressibility, a phenomenon nobody understood, where the controls simply stopped working. Even the Germans initially dismissed it. When Luftwaffe pilots first encountered P-38s over North Africa, they nicknamed it Der Gabelschwanz-Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, not from fear, but mockery. Here was an American fighter so distinctive you could spot it from 10 miles away, so unmaneuverable it couldn't dogfight, so complicated that half of them returned to base with mechanical failures. Easy prey, they thought. They had no idea what was coming. The transformation began with the last person anyone expected, a 42-year-old civilian who hadn't worn a uniform in decades. When Charles Lindbergh stepped onto the coral airstrip at Hollandia, New Guinea, in July 1944, the young pilots of the 475th Fighter Group couldn't hide their skepticism. Here was Lucky Lindy, the hero of their father's generation, gray-haired and wearing khakis instead of flight gear. He'd come as a technical representative for United Aircraft, but within hours of arrival, he was asking to fly combat missions. "The old man wants to go hunting," muttered Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, watching Lindbergh conduct his pre-flight inspection with methodical precision. Where the combat pilots did quick walkarounds, Lindbergh spent 40 minutes examining every rivet, every control surface, every drop of hydraulic fluid. He adjusted his seat multiple times, tested the oxygen system twice, and spent an eternity setting his engine controls. The younger pilots exchanged glances. This was going to be a long war if they had to babysit a celebrity. The first mission was a routine patrol to Japanese-held Seram Island, 400 miles round trip. Lindbergh flew wing, maintaining perfect formation, saying nothing on the radio. But when they landed, something was wrong with the fuel trucks. As pilots called out their remaining gallons, the pattern emerged: 175 gallons, 160 gallons, 150 gallons. Then Lindbergh, 260 gallons remaining. The operations officer checked his figures twice. It was impossible. They'd all flown the same distance, the same speed, the same altitude. The other pilots had landed on fumes, while Lindbergh had enough fuel for another 2 hours of flight. Lieutenant Miller, his wingman, finally asked what everyone was thinking. "Colonel Lindbergh, what did you do differently up there?" Lindbergh's response was matter-of-fact, almost apologetic. "Gentlemen, I believe you're flying these aircraft incorrectly. You're burning fuel as if you're racing at Cleveland. These engines will run quite efficiently at much lower settings." The room went silent. Here was a civilian telling combat veterans they didn't know how to fly their own planes. But the fuel gauges didn't lie. Whatever Lindbergh was doing, they needed to learn it, fast. The next morning, Lindbergh gathered the skeptical pilots around a P-38 on the flight line. What followed was a masterclass that contradicted everything they'd learned. "You're running these engines at 2200 RPM, he began, pointing to the tachometer. "Drop it to 1600. The pilots exchanged worried glances. The manual specifically warned against such low settings in combat zones. "Now increase your manifold pressure to compensate," Lindbergh continued, adjusting the throttles. "Yes, higher pressure with lower RPM. I know it seems backward." He moved to the mixture controls, the most controversial adjustment of all. "Lean them out further still, until the engines barely run smooth." Captain Danforth interrupted. "Sir, we'll burn up the cylinders." "The manual says." "The manual was written by engineers who never flew 8-hour missions," Lindbergh replied calmly. "Watch your cylinder head temperatures. They'll actually run cooler." The transformation was systematic, methodical, almost painful for pilots trained to fly by the book, where they'd been taught to treat their P-38s like thoroughbred racers. High RPM, rich mixture, maximum power always available. Lindbergh showed them how to fly like airline captains. Long, efficient cruising, patient throttle management. Trust in the engines to deliver power when needed, not constantly. The first converts came back with stunning reports. Major Thomas McGuire, the group's leading ace, returned from a 6-hour patrol with half his fuel remaining. "I kept waiting for the engines to quit," he admitted. "They never even hiccuped. Within days, missions previously impossible were routine. Patrols extended from 4 hours to 7. Escort ranges doubled overnight. But resistance remained fierce." Lieutenant Colonel Robert Westbrook voiced what many thought. "We're not flying transports. When a zero jumps you, you need immediate power, not fuel economy." Veterans who'd survived 2 years of combat weren't eager to adopt techniques that seemed to invite disaster. The evidence, however, was overwhelming. Lindbergh himself flew a 7.5-hour mission, engaged in combat, and landed with more fuel than pilots who'd flown half the distance using traditional settings. The P-38's complexity, those temperamental turbo superchargers, the intricate cooling systems, the sophisticated engine controls everyone cursed, suddenly revealed their purpose. They weren't design flaws. They were capabilities waiting to be understood. "You've been flying these machines at 65% efficiency," Lindbergh explained after another demonstration. "The engineers at Lockheed gave you a Swiss watch, and you've been using it as a hammer." The revelation was spreading through the squadron like wildfire. The P-38 wasn't too complex, it was precisely complex enough. Every system they'd considered a liability was actually an advantage if you knew how to use it. The fork-tailed devil was about to become an angel, and the Japanese would never see it coming. The magic lay in the P-38's very complexity. The same features that made it a maintenance nightmare made it perfect for Lindbergh's techniques. At the heart of the transformation were the twin Allison V1710 engines, each equipped with General Electric turbo superchargers. Unlike conventional fighters that lost power as they climbed, the P-38's turbos compressed thin air at altitude, maintaining sea-level power at 25,000 feet. This meant the engines could run at those impossible lean mixtures without losing performance where it mattered most. The numbers told the story. Standard combat settings burned 305 gallons per hour, both engines combined running rich to prevent detonation. Lindbergh's cruise control dropped consumption to 185 gallons per hour, a 40% reduction. But here was the revelation. At altitude, with turbochargers spinning at 24,000 RPM, the engines actually produced more usable power at the lower settings. The compressed air cooled the combustion chambers, allowing leaner mixtures that would destroy a conventional engine. Counter-rotating propellers, another P-38 exclusive, eliminated the torque effects that plagued single-engine fighters. In a P-51 or P-47, Reducing power meant constant rudder adjustments, pilot fatigue, wandering flight paths that burned extra fuel. The Lightning flew straight and true, its twin engines perfectly balanced, allowing pilots to set cruise control and actually relax for the first time in their combat careers. The twin boom design, mocked for its visibility to enemies, now revealed its aerodynamic genius. The central nacelle created less drag than a conventional fuselage, while the smooth airflow between the booms reduced turbulence. At Lindbergh's recommended settings, the P-38 slipped through the air with remarkable efficiency. Range jumped from 1,300 miles to 2,200 miles, enough to reach any target in the Pacific theater. But the real advantage was redundancy. Single-engine fighters running ultra-lean mixtures risked everything on one power plant. Lose it and you were swimming. The P-38 pilot could push both engines to the edge of efficiency, knowing that if one failed, the other would bring him home. This psychological safety net allowed pilots to embrace techniques they'd never dare attempt in a single-engine aircraft. The stable platform meant precise throttle management was actually possible. While P-47 pilots fought turbulence and P-51 pilots constantly adjusted trim, P-38 pilots could set their controls and monitor temperatures, adjusting mixture and manifold pressure with surgical precision. The very stability that made it boring in a dogfight made it perfect for long-range efficiency. "It's not about flying harder," Lindbergh explained to a group of engineers who'd flown out to investigate the impossible claims. "It's about flying smarter. Every gauge, every control in this cockpit has a purpose. Use them all, and this aircraft will take you anywhere in the Pacific and bring you home." The transformation wasn't just mechanical, it was deeply personal. Lieutenant Harold Rosser had been flying P-38s for 6 months when Lindbergh's techniques reached his squadron in Europe. "I used to dread the long missions," he wrote to his wife in September 1944. "Every minute over enemy territory felt borrowed. Now I volunteer for them." His first Berlin escort mission, 650 miles each way, would have been suicide with old techniques. Using Lindbergh's settings, he arrived over the German capital with enough fuel to engage Mi-109s for 20 minutes and still make it home. "The boys we're protecting can't believe we're still with them after 8 hours. Neither can the Germans." Captain Ray Crawford's story became legend in the 5th Air Force. On March 3, 1945, his left engine took flak over Formosa. Pre-Lindbergh, he would have pushed the remaining engine hard, burning fuel desperately trying to make land. Instead, Crawford feathered the dead prop, reduced the good engine to 1,400 RPM, and settled in for the longest flight of his life. 8 hours later, he touched down at Lingayen with 10 gallons remaining. "I had time to think up there," he recalled. "Really think. About my kids, about home, about how this airplane I'd cursed was saving my life. The old settings, I'd have been in the water in 2 hours." Colonel Charles MacDonald revolutionized patrol tactics once he mastered the new techniques. The Japanese had adapted to American patrol schedules, timing their dawn attacks for when P-38s were returning to base, fuel exhausted. MacDonald started launching his flights at midnight, arriving over Japanese airfields as the sun rose, catching enemy formations at their most vulnerable. "We'd orbit at 25,000 feet, engines purring at economy cruise waiting," he explained. "The Zeros would take off thinking they had clear skies. We'd been there for hours, still had hours of fuel left. It was like shooting fish in a barrel." But no one embodied the transformation like Major Richard Bong. Already an ace when Lindbergh arrived, Bong embraced the techniques with scientific precision. He extended his hunting grounds deep into Japanese territory, loitering over enemy bases where no American fighter had dared linger. His fuel discipline became legendary, returning from 8-hour missions with reserves other pilots couldn't achieve in 4 hours. Dick turned into a different pilot, his crew chief remembered. Before he was aggressive but careful, always watching his fuel. After Lindbergh, he was fearless. He knew that airplane would bring him home from anywhere. Bong's kill count soared from 28 to 40, making him America's ace of aces. In his last letter home before rotating stateside, he wrote, "The P-38 isn't the plane I learned to fly. It's become something else entirely. We used to fight despite our aircraft. Now we dominate because of it." The psychological shift rippled through every squadron. Pilots who had nicknamed their P-38s the Flying Coffin or Widowmaker began painting new names. Angel of Mercy, Long Legs, and Pacific Wanderer. They weren't flying the same airplane anymore. They were flying a machine that had finally been understood, and with that understanding came a confidence that transformed the air war. The hunters had become the hunted, and it all started with moving a few levers differently. The breaking point came in September 1944, recorded in a decoded Japanese naval communication that revealed their growing desperation. Commander Takeo Shibata, stationed at Balikpapan, reported to Combined Fleet Headquarters. Enemy twin-engine fighters appeared over our airfield at 0630 and maintained continuous patrol until 1430. This is impossible. Nearest American base is 650 miles distant. Request verification of intelligence estimates. For 2 years, Japanese defensive strategy had relied on a simple calculation. American fighters had a 300-mile combat radius. Plan attacks for 400 miles out and you were safe from escort. Position airfields 350 miles from enemy bases and you could launch strikes with impunity. It was mathematics, physics, the immutable law of fuel consumption, until it wasn't. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October shattered their certainty completely. Japanese Admiral Onishi had positioned his kamikaze squadrons precisely 420 miles from American airfields, certain they could launch without fighter interference. As his pilots prepared for their one-way missions, P-38s appeared overhead, not passing through, not making a quick sweep, but circling, waiting. They'd been there since dawn and showed no signs of leaving. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, leading the first official kamikaze unit, wrote in his final diary entry, "The fork-tailed devils follow us everywhere. There is no distance far enough, no dawn early enough. They appear like ghosts and stay like demons. How can they fly for 10 hours? It defies reason." The psychological collapse was swift and devastating. Japanese pilots who had operated from safe distances now found P-38s waiting over their runways. Reconnaissance flights reported American fighters 800 miles from the nearest base, still having enough fuel to engage in combat. Transport pilots changed routes 3 times, 4 times, only to find P-38s at every turn. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi, one of Japan's surviving aces, later testified, "We stopped believing our intelligence officers. They kept saying the Americans couldn't be there, but they were. Every morning they were already circling when we took off. Every evening they were still there when we tried to land. We began to feel we were fighting ghosts." The numbers told the story of strategic collapse. In August 1944, Japanese bombing missions had a 65% success rate reaching their targets. By November, after P-38s began flying Lindbergh style, that number plummeted to 15%. The mathematics of war had changed overnight. Distance, Japan's greatest defensive asset in the Pacific, had evaporated. The ocean that protected them had become a highway for American fighters that seemed to have conquered the very laws of physics. The transformation spread through the Pacific theater like a tactical revolution. Within 6 weeks of Lindbergh's first demonstration, every P-38 squadron from New Guinea to the Philippines was practicing cruise control. Training manuals were hastily rewritten, fuel consumption charts recalculated, mission profiles completely reimagined. What started as one civilian's observation became doctrine that rewrote the air war. General George Kenney, MacArthur's air commander, immediately grasped the strategic implications. "Lindbergh just gave me 1,000 more fighters," he told his staff. "Every P-38 can now do the work of 3. MacArthur himself revised the entire island-hopping campaign. Japanese strongholds previously requiring capture to provide forward airfields could now be bypassed entirely. Rabaul, Wewak, Halmahera, fortresses that would have cost thousands of lives, were simply left to wither as P-38s flew past them to strike deeper targets. The impact on bomber crews was immediate and profound. B-24 pilot Major Robert Sternfels had watched too many friends fall to Japanese fighters in the gap between fighter escort and target. "We called it Coffin Corner, that last 150 miles where we were alone," he recalled. Then suddenly the P-38s were with us all the way. "First time it happened, I thought they were lost. Radio operator says, 'Sir, they're waggling their wings goodbye.' I checked my watch. They'd been with us 7 hours. Bomber loss rates plummeted from 15% to 2% almost overnight. The psychological effect on crew morale was incalculable. Missions previously considered suicide runs became routine milk runs. The B-29 program, struggling with mechanical issues and Japanese interception, suddenly had P-38s escorting them 400 miles to targets in the Japanese homeland. Japanese pilot memoirs revealed the depth of their despair. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace, wrote, "We had no answer. Every tactic, every strategy assumed the Americans had limits. When those limits vanished, we were fighting ghosts. You could not run far enough, climb high enough, or hide deep enough. The fork-tailed shadows were always there. The revolution wasn't limited to P-38s. Lindbergh's principles spread to P-47 and P-51 squadrons. Though no aircraft benefited as dramatically as the Lightning, Navy Corsair pilots adapted the techniques for carrier operations. Transport pilots increased cargo capacity by carrying less fuel reserve. The entire American Air Armada was learning to fly smarter, not harder. By December 1944, reconnaissance P-38s were photographing targets in Indochina, Formosa, and the Chinese coast. Missions that would have required 3 refueling stops now flown non-stop. The Japanese defensive perimeter hadn't been broken. It had been made irrelevant. The P-38, once the problem child of American aviation, had become the key that unlocked the Pacific. And it all came from learning to move the throttles differently. By war's end, the statistics told a story of complete metamorphosis. The P-38's kill ratio in the Pacific had soared from a marginal 2.1 in early 1943 to an astounding 10.1 by 1945. More Japanese aircraft fell to P-38s than any other American fighter. The Widowmaker had become the Pacific's apex predator, and the numbers proved it. 1/800 enemy aircraft destroyed, against 180 P-38s lost in air combat. At a 1962 reunion in Tokyo, former enemies met to discuss their wartime experiences. Commander Kenji Yanagiya, who had survived 37 encounters with American fighters, was unequivocal. The P-38 was our nightmare. Not the Mustang, not the Corsair, the Lightning. It came from nowhere, stayed forever, and followed us home. When asked which American fighter he most respected, Zero Ace Tetsuzo Iwamoto didn't hesitate. The fork-tailed devil. It broke our spirits. The American pilots who had once filed transfer requests now sang different songs. Colonel Thomas Lynch, who in 1942 had written a scathing report calling the P-38 unsuitable for combat operations, commanded a Lightning squadron through the Philippines campaign. "I was wrong," he admitted simply. "We all were. We were trying to fly it like a P-40 with 2 engines. Lindbergh showed us it was something entirely different, a strategic weapon, not just a fighter." The irony wasn't lost on aviation historians. The P-38's greatest strength hadn't come from new engines, better armament, or improved aerodynamics. It came from moving existing controls differently. The same aircraft that killed test pilots in 1942 was setting distance records in 1945. Nothing had changed except understanding. Captain Perry Dahl, who flew P-38s from their darkest days through their triumph, captured the transformation perfectly. We spent 2 years cursing every component, the turbochargers, the complexity, the fuel system, those damn counter-rotating props. Turns out every flaw was a feature. We just didn't know it. The plane was smarter than we were. The final evaluation came from an unexpected source. Kurt Tank, designer of Germany's legendary FW-190, studied captured P-38s after the war. His conclusion: the Americans built a plane 5 years ahead of its time, then took 3 years to learn to fly it properly. Once they did, it was unbeatable. The Lightning had traveled the longest journey of any fighter in the war, not in miles, but in reputation. From death trap to war winner, from liability to legend, all because one man had the wisdom to question what everyone knew was true. The P-38's transformation carries lessons that echo far beyond World War II. In every generation, military institutions face the same challenge. The very expertise that creates doctrine can blind us to better solutions hiding in plain sight. It took Charles Lindbergh, a civilian and outsider, someone unencumbered by 2 years of combat habits, to see what thousands of trained pilots had missed. Today's military grapples with similar paradoxes. Drone operators discover that gaming experience often trumps traditional flight training. Cyber warriors find that teenage hackers outmaneuver academy graduates. The F-35, like the P-38 before it, is called too complex, too expensive, too ambitious. Yet history suggests we may simply not understand it yet. The pattern repeats: revolutionary capability disguised as overwhelming complexity, waiting for someone to question the manual. Lindbergh's contribution wasn't technical genius. Any engineer could have calculated the fuel savings. It was the courage to challenge institutional knowledge, to suggest that everyone was wrong. In modern terms, he was the outsider who asked why we've always done it this way. The P-38 didn't need modification. It needed reinterpretation. The broader truth transcends aviation. How many systems do we operate at 65% efficiency? Because that's how we were taught. How many capabilities remain locked behind our assumptions? The P-38 syndrome appears everywhere. In businesses running outdated processes, in technologies used far below their potential, in human talents constrained by conventional wisdom. Perhaps the deepest lesson is humility. The same pilots who called the P-38 a death trap were outstanding aviators. Their expertise wasn't wrong, it was incomplete. They knew everything about flying fighters, which prevented them from seeing that the P-38 wasn't quite a fighter. It was something new, waiting for new thinking. The Lightning's legacy reminds us that sometimes the most powerful innovations aren't inventions, but insights. The next revolution might not require new technology. It might just require someone willing to move the throttles differently.